MP Tim Wilson, who is the chair of the Economics Committee. Tim Wilson, thanks so much for your time. Your committee going to be hearing from APRA and others. What do you want to hear from the regulator?
What we're going to hear from APRA is around, obviously, the implementation of the Royal Commission's recommendations and how they're going with that, but also around their internal culture, particularly as a result of the recent capability review that was led by Graham Samuel.
What in particular do you want to hear? Because we've heard some mixed reports about whether they are genuine, especially with those comments from APRA following Graham Samuel's review. Is there anything key that you're going to be asking them specifically on Friday?
Well, on Friday we have two hearings. We have one with the Reserve Bank in the morning and APRA in the afternoon. And what we particularly want to hear from the APRA is whether they're going to follow through with the recommendations, particularly around the capability review. As you outlined, there's been some discussion since Graham Samuel completed his report about whether APRA intends to continue to go on with that. And I understand that it ultimately comes down to internal culture and operations, ranging from where they should create new divisions to oversight superannuation, all the way through to how they're going to approach issues around deposit-taking institutions. So it will be wide-ranging because it will be the first chance, but it will also be an opportunity for them to outline very clearly what they plan to do around prudential regulation to increase confidence from the public, particularly after their recent experiences.
So much of what's happening internationally, of course, out of our control, but the RBA has reflected in recent times, Governor Lowe, on infrastructure, and I guess that's something you'll be picking up with him on Friday when you meet?
It will be, but I think some of us are I'll speak for myself, pretty sceptical about the idea that the solution is simply to pump more money into the economy. We already have, it seems like he's throwing his hands up and saying he's exhausted the options of monetary policy, so now the solution is stimulus. In fact, through investment in infrastructure, if you actually look particularly at Melbourne, it's almost impossible to build more infrastructure in Melbourne at the moment. The same is also partly true in New South Wales. It seems to me that the infrastructure sector is basically now going through its own equivalent of the mining boom, where wages and equipment and labour is in short supply. And the real issues we're also going to have to confront is structural reform and what that means.
Isn't that counter to the government's stance, really? We've heard Scott Morrison consistently say he's going to stimulate the economy with the income tax cuts which came through and the $100 billion in infrastructure. No,
not at all. I mean, this is utterly consistent with what we're doing. We've already provided or delivered tax cuts, which is fiscal stimulus, and for infrastructure, we're already rolling that out. But if the expectation is that we're going to be able to do more of it and not create some challenges, in addition to what we've already committed, then I think we need to have a bigger look at the whole picture, and so structural reform needs to be part of that conversation as well.
And from your perspective, what do you see as some of the avenues that should be pursued? Is it the workplace? Where else can the government make some reforms there?
Well, we've already made reforms to the tax system, and they're welcome because they're flattening out and simplifying the tax system in the most recent budget. The question, I think, that we have to consider as a parliament is whether there's options to do that, more of that, to even out the tax system. I see Paul Keating was out there today saying the top marginal tax rate is still too high. Well, you know, let's broken clocks can be right twice a day, and I welcome those comments. But yes, industrial relations reform also needs to be part of that discussion. I know that the new Minister for Industrial Relations, Christian Porter, is looking at what can constructively be done. But I mean, let's not be under any illusion. There is a need for industrial relations reform. The opponents of industrial relations reform have always been the Labor Party because they see it as a diminishing of their power and influence rather than what's in the best interest of Australian workers and job creation. If Labor keeps putting themselves ahead of the national interest, there will ultimately have to be political disagreement about it.
What do you make of Jim Chalmers' comments? The Shadow Treasurer was on just a short time ago responding to Paul Keating's comments about Labor's tax policy. They still haven't ruled out negative gearing as a policy or reform or franking credit reform. And he was saying that the attack very much should be on the government, saying that the Liberal Party's anti-superannuation altogether.
Well, Jim Chalmers is delusional in his attack and his criticism, trying to deflect because he actually doesn't have serious answers on these questions. They went to an election promising $387 billion worth of new taxes. Since the election, they've then said that our tax cuts are inadequate concurrently, while holding on to their policies to increase taxes by up to $387 billion. There is no hostility towards super in the coalition. We just want a simple conversation around the ongoing potential of the sector to make sure it's responsive and delivers exactly what it's intended to. Chalmers really needs to pull his head in and probably listen to some of the advice from people like Paul Keating, who actually seems to have a better understanding of the challenges the Australian economy faces than the Shadow Treasurer at the moment.
When you look at the economic outlook, obviously there are a lot of uncertainty. They, described as headwinds or whatever else. But do you feel, are you reassured that the fundamentals are still there, even without some of that structural reform that we touched on earlier?
Well, the fundamentals of the Australian economy are strong. We have high employment, which is critical. We have home ownership, healthy home ownership rates. We have people investing, but we know we've come out of an environment where people were terrified about a change of government. There needs to be an increase in investment to keep that growth going. The fundamentals are there, but we have fine-tuning and we can always do more. The biggest risk, you're right, we face at the moment is the international environment and international markets and political decisions that are made outside of our control, ranging from us being basically now a interest rate taker because of decisions made in the United States over the past decade, all the way through to the threats now of trade conflict and wars. And so we have to be very prudent and responsible. That's why maintaining the budget surplus is critical, while pursuing sensible economic reform and structural reform is also going to be critical to build that sense of confidence so people invest and we create jobs for Australians.
Tim Wilson will be watching the Economics Committee closely on Friday, but thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much.